Welcome to En Route, the podcast of the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute. The First Responder Behavioral Health Institute is bringing together some of the most inspiring and dedicated change agents in the global public safety, psychotherapy, and educational communities. Each episode of En Route seeks to bring together first responder change agents and clinicians dedicated to constructively disrupting the status quo by tackling the tough subjects like first responder suicide, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, sanctuary trauma, leadership development, critical incident response, peer support teams, and what it means to be psychologically safe and healthy while working in an unsafe world. All units, please stand by. The En Route podcast is about to begin. You can resume normal traffic on this channel after this transmission. Greetings and welcome to En Route, the podcast of the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute. I'm Joseph Brigandi. This is our first episode of 2025, and we are getting an extreme privilege to introduce a change maker, an educator, a paramedic, and a physician. Dr. Zachary Tillet has written a wonderful course called Breaking Bad News with Compassion and Professionalism. As you know, being a first responder and being on the scene of line of duty deaths or having to do death notifications with a patient is perhaps some of the most challenging work you're ever going to have to do. You also know that you didn't receive any training in doing this and how to do it effectively, compassionately, and from the heart. We got the privilege of meeting with Dr. Tillet and looking at his program and courses, and we were extremely excited when he wanted to go ahead and work with us to bring that information to you and to go ahead and share it with the first responder community. So, without further ado, allow me to introduce Dr. Zachary Tillet, ask him about his course, and also to encourage you, if you're watching us right now on YouTube, to please go ahead and head on over and ask questions of us during the broadcast. Without further ado, allow me to go ahead and introduce Dr. Zachary Tillet to the show. Hey, Zach, how are you this morning?
Hey, it's good to meet you. We'll see you again.
Thank you. It's great to have you here. Most of our people don't have the privilege of knowing your background, your passion, and what you do and how you do it. Would you go ahead and let us know a little bit about how you got into this field and what your history has been as a first responder and a physician?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started out as when I first got to college, there was a local rescue squad. I had a friend who'd been volunteering in EMS, and I thought, wow, that sounded awesome. So I ended up signing up. And so there I was right around the age of 18, 19, started volunteering in my local rescue squad and absolutely fell in love. Spent as much time at the firehouse and the rescue squad as I could. And eventually decided to become a paramedic. Got my paramedic and was working generally in the Northern Virginia area for a couple years. Did a bunch of different stuff. I spent some time in the emergency department as a paramedic. I spent some time doing interfacility critical care transport for the Children's Hospital in DC. And then I ended up deciding I wanted to go to medical school. Went to medical school down in Norfolk, Virginia, then ended up at Maine Medical Center for residency in Portland, Maine, and then just completed fellowship in EMS at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And currently I'm working as an emergency medicine physician and doing some EMS work down in Southern Maryland.
Excellent, excellent. And then through this journey and your path, something moved you to go ahead and create a course like this. And I think you and I both know what's behind that, but let everybody know what prompted you to create a course for delivering this type of information, and how does this program of study work?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started out with this, volunteering as an EMTB and later as a paramedic, at the age of 18, I pretty much had very little life experience, especially around things like death and dying. And I found myself in these situations where I was having to talk to families about it, showing up on cardiac arrest, and I was being tasked with talking to the family during the arrest, or showing up on things where, a patient had was already deceased, and I was having to talk to families about that. And without that life experience and really kind of lacking the emotional maturity to how to navigate those conversations, I really struggled with them. And that was a huge problem because, I'd never received any training on this. And I kind of figured, you know, my way through these conversations, but they felt very awkward. I felt like a lot of times I did a real disservice to these families. But here I was 18 years old and no one ever taught me about how to talk about these things. I didn't have the life experience. How was I supposed to anticipate what I should or shouldn't do or say? And so I felt like I kind of failed those families in a lot of ways. But I also felt a little bit like the system had failed me because I hadn't been given, the tools to really do that. You would never send somebody out to work a cardiac arrest without training them on how to do the medical aspects of it. But what about, the other aspects of it? And so that's what got me thinking about this. And really, when I got to medical school was the first time I got actual training on how to break bad news. And my big takeaway from that was, wow, this is not rocket science. This stuff is not super hard. But having somebody tell me like, hey, this is what you definitely don't do. This might be something that you could do in this situation was really empowering for me. And I remember thinking to myself like, wow, this is something that we need to target and provide more education for our first responders for.
Absolutely. And when many people don't understand now, the evolution of the paramedic program has reached the place where we run cardiac arrests often to completion right there in the residence. So if that doesn't work out well, the paramedic team is now in the position of having to deliver this news without any training on how to do so. I've navigated this when I got a chance to look at your course and go through your curriculum. Wow, I really reflected on all the times that I've had to do this by trial by fire, trial by error. Maybe I didn't say the most effective thing there, or they asked me 3 times, if their loved one had died, and I struggled to go ahead and repeat that, and not realizing as I grew into becoming a therapist, I realized, okay, they just slid into that denial phase. So yes, you might have to deliver that again for them, but I didn't understand how the human mind works in trauma and loss and grief. And it's a complex subject, but as you said, it's also a subject that can be delivered very clearly and in a format that can help that person start that process to where they can come to terms with what's just happened, and you can be very helpful to them as well. Another thing with our paramedics, I try to tell them is when a critical incident has terminated, you're still not done. If we start looking at the psychological aspects of all the people who had seen a car wreck or all the people that might have been affected by that loss of life, you still have a lot of work left to do on the scene, and we don't teach that either. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think first and foremost, I want to mention, I agree with you 100% that, there's been a shift. So back in 2011, the National Association of EMS Physicians transitioned and basically started supporting the termination of cardiac arrests in the pre-hospital environment. Prior to that time, pretty much all cardiac arrests were brought to the ER. And so the burden of telling families that their loved one had died was more often than not was actually happening from ER physicians who were giving that notification. However, since 2011, most EMS agencies have adopted, working these cardiac arrests in the pre-hospital environment and actually terminating them. Not all the time, but a lot of times. And so probably if you're working EMS, your agencies have some sort of protocol where most cardiac arrests are showing up on scene and you're working it in the house. And when we look at the national average, there's some 400,000 cardiac arrests in the pre-hospital environment in the US every year. So there's certainly volume there. And then when we look at the survival rates from cardiac arrests in the pre-hospital environment, best places we're talking 5-10%, survival. So what that means is we have 400,000 cardiac arrests, in a year. That means there's hundreds of thousands of people potentially dying in the home every year. And that doesn't even include the patients that are found already deceased, where, the burden of telling the families is probably falling on EMS clinicians themselves. And so that's been a huge shift. And I think that's one of the things where we need to consider, how we're providing education about this. And I think that's probably why there wasn't as much education about this previously. But now, since we've had this shift, and it's been almost 15 years now, I think we need to start addressing it more actively. And so one of the things I wanted to mention is when I got out into residency, I decided I actually wanted to look into how often EMS clinicians were getting training on this. And so I actually distributed a nationally based survey and got about 1,100 responses back from EMS clinicians all over the country. And basically, what they kind of that survey showed is that less than half of EMS clinicians had ever received any kind of training on breaking bad news, and that the most surprising thing was about 95% wanted additional training. And so even those who had received training felt this was not inadequate. One of the things I was most concerned about with my surveys, I asked for potential causes of harm. And what we actually found is about 40 to 50%, somewhere in there, of EMS clinicians reported in the last year having some sort of emotional difficulty around having one of these difficult conversations. And so that was really eye-opening for me. And that, that emotional difficulty included like intrusive thoughts, repetitive thoughts, lost sleep. And, that kind of fit with my own experiences with EMSs, because you unfortunately will end up on things like a cardiac arrest where you know, uh, talk to family and it's just they have a horrible response, or it's a very sad cardiac arrest, or it's hard to walk away from that and not be affected. So I think that's a major thing. And so that's what led to me to kind of recognize and realize that this is something that we need to do something about. And that's what I eventually led to me kind of implementing this curriculum, which I can also talk about the design and development of. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question. I kind of got on a little bit of a tangent there, but.
No, oh, absolutely answered it perfectly. And one of the things that leads me to want to go ahead and make sure people understand about this is you didn't just slap together a curriculum. You've done research. This is an evidence-based design, and you've already beta tested it with large groups of first responders. So tell us a little bit about how that research went and how it's been received in the field.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I did to create this curriculum is I looked at, the training I had received on how to break bad news, and that training has been excellent, but it was all designed around the in-hospital environment. And a lot of the writings and teachings about palliative care and how to have difficult conversations with families are actually coming from oncologists and in hospital and in clinic-based situations. And there's few things less like a 911 call than trying to take the experience of an EMS clinician and the experience of an oncologist breaking bad news are so far apart that I thought this needed its own unique approach. I mean, if you think about it, if you're an oncologist and you have to tell somebody that, their cancer has reoccurred or getting worse, like a lot of times that's happening in a clinic, it's clean, you may have an established relationship. And when you compare that to EMS clinicians, you often don't know the patient. They may have been, totally healthy and normal and functioning a few minutes before, and maybe they had a cardiac arrest while they're eating dinner with their family, and you show up, and this is all so sudden and so fast, and you're meeting the family, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes after this horrible experience is happening, where you're coming in doing CPR. You're actually having to be physically involved with a cardiac arrest. Do high stress skills, things like intubate, place IOs, all this stuff. You work the cardiac arrest, and it gets to a point where you have to terminate it. You may still also be the same person that's actually having to give the news. And that's not that common in any other place in the hospital, with the exception of it happens maybe to some degree in the ER, where ER physicians are getting these patients that cardiac arrests, with some frequency, and then they are having to resuscitate them, and maybe a little bit to a degree in the ICU. But once they're in hospital, a lot of times they've had at a time to establish rapport with the family. So totally different situations. It's what I did is I thought to myself, I was like, we need to set up and determine a way that's unique to EMS clinicians. And so I figured, as an EMS clinician and as a physician, I needed support. And so what I did is I got other people who are experts in the field. I got other ER physicians. I got a ER palliative care physician, Michelle Crispo, who I have to give a shout out to, because none of this would have happened without her. I got pediatric palliative care social workers. I've got child life specialists. We had experienced EMS clinicians and EMS physicians, and all these people kind of came together. And together we wrote 2 papers, and these are kind of consensus papers on what we thought would be the best techniques, taking the established in-hospital techniques and how could we apply those to the pre-hospital techniques, and published 2 papers on this topic. Both of them are in the International Journal of Paramedicine, and you can find those online. They're free, and one is about how to actually deliver death notification in the pre-hospital environment, and the other one is specifically about how to run an emotionally supportive cardiac arrest. So how do you show up on the scene of a cardiac arrest and actually start to prepare the family for the most likely outcome, which is that their loved one is going to unfortunately die. Because again, remember that only 5 to 10% are going to survive. And a lot of times you probably show up on these cardiac arrests and you look at the patient's medical comorbidities, you look at the patient's overall health, and you show up and they're asystole and your end title's terrible. Realistically that's not going to be the patient that you're probably going to get back. It's not that, VF arrest who was walking down the street and got high quality CPR, and you roll in and you got a decent chance of getting him back. Very different situation. So Kind of running that idea of that running that emotionally supportive cardiac arrest is how do we support families and get to ease the burden of the emotional blow that their loved one has, unexpectedly or even sometimes somewhat expectedly, passed away or died. And then how do we deliver that notification? So that's the kind of theme of those two papers. And what I did is I took both of those papers and I actually used those to design the curriculum. And I had to think about how I would do this curriculum. There's good research out there that you can take both physicians and actually paramedics, and with as little as 2 hours of training, you can provide them with an increases in confidence and their ability to deliver death notifications and have difficult conversations with patients. So that idea that even just minimal training can help already exists and it has been studied. And so what I did is I wanted to create something that could be distributed to the masses. A lot of training involves, using standardized patients and things like that. And to me, I thought to myself, that's not really that scalable. How do we get this out there to all EMS clinicians? And so what I did is I designed a curriculum that can be done completely online. And currently, the curriculum is up online with the First Responders Behavioral Health Network. So, but what we did is we took that curriculum and it's designed into two parts. The first part is about an hour-long lecture that I give, and we tackle all kinds of different topics. One, how to run that emotionally supportive cardiac arrest, but also how to deal with other things like what do you do when you show up on scene and families are angry at you? I'm sure most of us have been on a cardiac arrest where you show up and you may have driven as fast as you could to get there and you got a really great time. So you got there 3 minutes, but to that family, it felt like an hour before you got there. And so they're super pissed at you. And they really want you, they're mad from the get-go. How do you overcome that? And then we talk about things like other things like what do you do if people have, specific religious requests, or what do you do if people have, you know, uh, um, kids on scene. So if there's like a child, a young child is present, how do you deal with that kid? Do you let them watch the cardiac arrest? Do you move them out? And then how do you deal with it on children of various ages? You may have a 4-year-old, which is going to be very different than how you deal with a 12-year-old. So we tackle all that, in the curriculum in that, hour-long video, as well as how to actually make that death notification in a structured approach. And this is not supposed to be, the end-all be-all course. What it is designed to give you some kinds of do's and don'ts and a general heuristic so that you can hang your hat on how do I actually approach this situation. And so the next part of the course, so after you watch that video, which is all online, is a series of cases. And I designed the cases so that anybody on their next shift, when they're sitting around with their EMS crew or in the firehouse eating dinner, is they actually print out these cases. And it's a series of cases that designed to be self-led. And so one person will actually read through the cases. You guys can kind of discuss, how would you approach each of these situations? And basically what it deals with is a series of different cardiac arrests where you would have to make a death notification and kind of discuss like, hey, if our next call is this call where we show up and there is a single parent that is, in cardiac arrest and there is a 6-year-old on scene, what would we do? What would be our approach? Who's going to actually be doing the medical care? Who are we going to call to support that child? How are we going to support that child? Do we let them work that cardiac arrest? So the next time you get that call, you've actually thought about this and have a plan in place. And so those are a lot of the major focuses, but it takes about an hour to work through all those cases. Some people do it a little bit faster. Some people do it a little bit longer. It really depends on the group and the conversation they have around it. And, again, with how they should approach these things are all designed, how you can approach them with your own first due and your own first agency, knowing your protocols, knowing what resources you have. You may have, a co-responder team that can come out of, a critical incident stress team, or some sort of, behavioral response team that can come out and kind of help offload you guys from the, talking with family and while you work on the medical aspects of the cardiac arrest. But a lot of agencies don't have that, or they may not be able to respond for a period of time. And you have to figure out what to do for the next, couple minutes with family who may be extremely upset, et cetera. So it's really challenging. So that's one of the other things. So we have the hour-long lecture, then we have these cases that you just print out and you work through together, next time you're on shift at the firehouse or whatever. Or if they want to be, people wanted to include it in, their standard training for like, say, continuing education and things like that, it can be done in larger groups. So that was kind of the first part of your question. What do we actually design? The second part of the question of how do we actually test this? I don't know if you have any questions about that, Joseph, or do you want me to talk about how we actually tested this in the study?
Please, let's go ahead and go into the testing aspect. How did you test this out?
Yeah, so what I actually did is we took our curriculum and we tried it out. So we took a 900-person professional fire-based EMS system in the Mid-Atlantic region, so very professional, high-performing fire department, and we implemented this as part of their spring continuing education. And we had a total of a little over 500 EMS clinicians from that department actually take the course. And what we did is we did a survey before, looking at education, their experiences around breaking bad news, and their confidence levels in different situations. How comfortable are you in having to deliver a death notification? How comfortable are you delivering a death notification with a pediatric patient present? How comfortable are you dealing with anger from a family member? And then what we did is we delivered the course. And so everybody watched the course online at some point during a 3-month period. And then they actually had to follow up for an in-person session. In the in-person session, they actually watched a brief refresher video that's about 10 minutes long, also available as part of the course. And then everybody sits down and works through the cases together in these small groups of 4 to 5 people. And what we did is, I didn't teach any of these courses. I did audit some of them, but basically where I just went and sat in the back and just to kind of observe and see how things were going. And we studied both before and after. And what we found out from our responses is that only about 40% of our EMS clinicians had ever received training on breaking bad news. So had a lot of them that had not. And we actually looked at our confidence levels before and after. And after taking the course, people loved the course. It was about 90% of our, a little over 90% thought that the course was either helpful, and about 65% felt that it was extremely helpful. So really got a lot out of the course, even though it was just the 2 hours. Other things that we found that were super beneficial to the course, and that were highlighted, is that about 70% felt that they walked away with some sort of skill that be able to take, with them moving forward. So that was great, and we're really proud of that because we try to provide people with some tools that they could actually use on future cardiac arrests. How to navigate these things with families, and then. What was perhaps the most exciting was about a little over 90% felt that all EMS clinicians should be taught this course. And to me, so even those that may not have found the course very helpful for them personally, and maybe that's due to experience or having a lot of training or a lot of life experience with this course, with this topic, prior to taking the course, they still thought other people should be getting this education. So I thought that was great. When we looked at factors for EMS clinician comfort and confidence with having these conversations on every single metric that we looked at, there was statistically and significant increase across the board. And so we're currently writing that study up, and we're going to be looking to publish it in the near future. You actually be able to look through how successful the course was, but overall got rave reviews. The fire department I was working at in a local ER at the time, and all the time medics were coming up to me and they're like, God, I wish somebody had given me this education, years ago. Or a lot of times what they found is that people were coming up to me and just, telling me about a really bad case they had. And they were like, man, I really wish, I'd gotten some of this before, just so I felt more comfortable about it. And that's one of the things is when I've talked and educated around this is I always find EMS clinicians are always coming up to me afterwards and telling me about this horrible case they were on, or where they felt they had a rough time having one of these conversations with families and how horribly it stuck with them. And I get it. I 100% get it because, I've had that same experience. And so that's kind of where we got to. And so the next steps were to throw the course up online, and now it's available for everybody. So anybody can take that course 100% free. I think, when it comes to EMS clinician mental health, something like this, I think it's just such an important topic that I wanted to be free. So I really appreciate you, Joseph, taking it and putting it up on the Institute, because I think it's a great way to get that message out to other people.
Thank you. It's an honor to have the program, and I just loved how it was put together. Being in the field so long, you really did design it for the first responder. You can get that hour's training in. You can get back to the rest of your duties. Bringing your crew back to it, just one question a shift. You could stretch this out to where it doesn't go ahead and take up the whole time, or you can go ahead and go through it, fairly quickly. So your pacing is yours. It's perfect for a shift-based pacing, and it's evidence-based, highly researched. Papers are coming out about it. More work is being done on it, and I love everything I'm hearing. The fact that our first responders are coming up to you and they're having this discussion, that's allowing them to offload some of that stress and to also acknowledge some of what the challenges that they've gone through with it. And one of the things I'm so glad that you discussed is patient family members' anger on field, on scene. One of the things that people I've often said is our profession was aided a great deal by a television show that was on when I was a kid. And that was a wonderful show. However, John and Roy never lost a patient in 8 seasons. So there seems to be a little bit of a sense that if we're here, well, then this person is going to live, and they don't understand we're not superhuman and we are not heroes. We're doing a job to the best of our ability, and that person may not survive the outcome of what caused that cardiac arrest. We are doing our very best, but there's a sense on the public that since you're here, that somehow this is going to fix itself because you're Superman. That leads us down some definite roads with our first responders and how they're dealing with it and how they're processing having to provide this service when they're on scene. I've had a couple of cases in the clinical suite where paramedics have delivered this news and they've had to come see me, and they have been upset by it. Fortunately, 90% of the time, I have a first responder slide into our clinical environment. They're assuming because they're having intrusive thoughts, because they're having trouble sleeping, I therefore have PTSD. And the joy of this is I get the privilege of telling them over 80% of the time, no, you don't. You have post-traumatic stress, that this is going to go away pretty quickly. It's going to go away a lot quicker if you start processing it and we talk about what happened, how you felt about it. It's also fear goes away with knowledge. So the more you read about death and dying, loss and grief, the more you understand more of what the clinician understands, the more of what, if you're able to understand what you're trying to give them, the gift that you're trying to give them within this course, helps them to understand how to navigate this stuff on their own personal psychological level with their crew, with that young first responder who it's his first time he's had to sit there and assist in a death notification, to the senior assaultee veteran who probably figured this out the hard way, but definitely wants everybody to benefit from the education they didn't have. So there's a lot of heart here, a lot of education here, and you're on the cutting edge of first responder research, and I think we need to acknowledge that. Where's this course going from here? You and I have talked a little bit about its expansion in the future. One of the other things that is coming up now, and we get the privilege of doing this, we run a crisis response team with clinicians on it for the Institute. So more and more mental health people can be on scene. Are they any more trained or better trained than the paramedic? Probably not, just because you have a graduate degree in clinical mental health, unless you specifically went after an education in death, dying, loss, grief, probably don't have the skills either. So future editions of this course, potentially providing a little bit of education for the what are we calling them now? Clinicians who work in the field. A whole new thing is emerging. We're starting to call them co-responders. So there will often be a therapist of some type, clinical social worker, licensed professional counselor, psychologist who is in the field working with police, fire, and EMS. Fortunately, we're starting to see that next evolution. The paramedic program has taken over 50 years to take hold. And as you and I know, in some jurisdictions, that still doesn't exist today. Now we're seeing a next level. We're recognizing behavioral health is essential. We're starting to ask the question, how do we get information like this into our paramedic manuals? And we're starting to ask the question, how do we interface with clinicians, get them educated enough where they are co-responders or first responder clinicians as we train at the Institute. And it is certainly ongoing and cutting edge research, but ongoing courses or a next module for the co-responder. Do you think we're reaching a point where that is something you want to consider doing in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think a lot of the course is applicable to what the co-responders may be experiencing. So that's definitely one thing I've been interested in potentially developing. Other thing is potentially creating something for law enforcement. I do a fair amount of work with different law enforcement agencies as well. And I think increasingly there's more of a blending of roles. And so I think, that may be one area where there's a lot of room for this, where law enforcement officers have even less training on these kind of breaking bad news conversations, I think, than EMS clinicians. Yet often they're the ones tasked with calling families and things like that. I was talking to some state troopers a few months back, and they're talking about how, they may have to call and notify family after a bad car wreck, and they're cold calling family that may live in a different state and things like that. And so definitely have some interest. There's a lot of room for, training around these topics as we think more about things like people developing, post-traumatic stress responses, to having to have these conversations and things like that, and providing that education and background. I think both with co-responders, like you said, are probably not getting a lot of training on this, but neither are law enforcement. And so it's problematic. And I think really something that we need to start focusing on for all of our clinicians. And I think it's so important, because if you can prevent that post-traumatic stress from occurring, these people are going to be happier, healthier, they're going to last longer in your jobs, decrease burnout potentially. And those I think are all benefits, and something that clearly there's been a increase and focus on in the first responder community. So those would be ultimate goals, is to create those courses. It's just got to find the time to do it. Always have a lot of projects I'm working on, so it took me years to kind of to go through and develop this course, and do it in an appropriate manner. So that is on the horizons of the future. I'm just not quite sure when that'll happen.
Good. And I'm glad it is, and that's something that we want to do our very best to help you and all first responder change agents. Our institute is now moving towards the institutional review process, so that some of our faculty professors, Dr. Bram Duffy, is looking to do research. And when we do research in the field as co-responders and with humans, those are live human subjects, so we have to have a university to work with to help us to coordinate that. Delivering death notifications is no different, so we're working with people in the field that need our help. So we're trying to go ahead and do cutting edge research to support that research, to support your research, and to see these kinds of programs grow within agencies. The most important thing is that this avenue is available, that it is free. It's part of the Institute. We're honored to have you as part of our faculty. Wanted to, let's say, get people to see how to get a hold of this course as easily as possible. So let me hit a button here and bring up your QR code. So if we go ahead and do that, and I'll leave that on the screen for just a moment or two, and you give that a click, that's going to take you directly to Dr. Tillett's course. You can go ahead and sign up and register for it. As we both said, it's free of charge. Take that course, take a couple of our other free courses, and look at some of the programs that we have on the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute. Currently, we have 17 instructors and over 40 different courses that are slated for release this quarter, and that number is expected to triple this year. And I'll take you to his course page right now, and we're going to see if we can get it to move. There it is. So that's all you got to do. It should take you to this course page, which will load in that first training. All of the additional course materials are located right here, so you can bring these cases right into your fire station, right into your EMS or first responder agency, and go ahead and utilize those. By the way, when you complete these courses of study, go ahead and take the final exams, and one of the things that we also will do is issue a certificate of completion for your time. So the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute does issue CEs, medical CEs, and we are a CE provider in the state of Texas, but many times other states accept those CEs as well, so you'll have to check with your local jurisdiction, but you definitely want to submit that for licensure. And we are also in the process of doing that with clinicians as well. So let me get Dr. Tillett back here, ask him a few more questions as we wrap up. What other thoughts do you want to share with our first responder audience about you, your work, the future of your work, and just anything else in the first responder world?
I think I just, really hope that people, if they see this, are willing to take this back to their firehouses or their, rescue squads, their departments, distribute it widely. Because even if you may be an experienced clinician and feel comfortable with this topic and not really struggle with it, there may be someone else out there who does. And so I think that's where it comes in, is that somebody else may benefit from this education. So it's a big thing, is I just want that education out there for people, or other education, whatever it is. I just hope that, if you were in a position in a department to help get people some sort of education around this topic, look into it, whether it's my course or another course. It's just, I think it's so important for keeping, clinicians mentally healthy. I just think it's really a travesty when we have people go out with and ask them to do this really incredibly challenging and emotionally fraught task without any training on how to do it, or with limited training on how to do it. So I think it's uh, something that we owe to our first responders and our clinicians to provide that education for them around the topic. And then just, if you do have negative emotional impacts of it, I think it's really important that you reach out to people and talk through the cases and what it did. And, whether that's a therapist or, other clinicians that you work with, that you trust, or family, friends, just be willing to talk about the stuff if you're having negative emotional impacts about it. It's not good to bottle that stuff up inside and kind of just keep on keeping on. I think that over time leads to more stress and more issues.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's in the talking about these things, whether it's in a formal debriefing setting, whether it's with your peers, doing some peer support, whether it's sliding in to see a clinician like us, that, if the call is lingering with you, let us go ahead and help you process through it. All complex trauma therapists know that PTSD happens when we are helpless and overwhelmed. Those are two of the most fundamental signs that are going to take you over the edge. You're not helpless, there's education and training. If you're feeling overwhelmed, seek peer support, go ahead and talk to family members, and come on in and see a clinician. Like I said, I'm a complex trauma specialist and a clinical mental health provider, and over 80% of the time that I run these tests on people, they don't have PTSD. They have post-traumatic stress. They were exposed to something significant, and it's not going to go ahead and become something severe. One of the reasons you showed up to go ahead and do this processing, many times one of the things I love the most is the spouse will call me in a few days and go, he's sleeping. He's sleeping like a log. What did you do? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to go into the session. I'm just so grateful that, his, sleep pattern has returned to normal. And so these changes and the ability to process complex trauma and grief don't have to take 5 years of therapy. It can take 5 or 10 sessions, and you can be in a whole different place to where you can go ahead and respond effectively. One of the other things I see when my first responders have gotten behavioral health care, they tend to be very proactive with other first responders. And a lot of times I'll get someone in my chair and they'll say, this person and that person had seen you 2 years ago. And I'm like, oh my goodness, it's such an honor to see that they're not only back in the field doing well, but they're encouraging, because they've had a positive experience in mental health, encouraging their colleagues to go ahead and seek it out. So behavioral health is an important part of our lives. Whether we realize it or not, it's like exercise. The other thing I like to share with them is that when you break a leg, we give you a treatment plan that we expect you to go ahead and fully recover. If there's a mental health concern, most of the time you fully recover from those two. Of course, there's a few pathologies where there's long-term care needed, but most people, like a broken arm, broken leg, needed a decent treatment plan. They needed some physical therapy afterwards. The road to recovery is short, and they're back out there again. And the same is true of the human mind. I spent a lot of my life trying to explain this to people, and we're finally starting to get through in the first responder community. So as we wrap up it today, any last words to our audience? And we'll go ahead and give you a moment to say goodbye to everybody before I wrap it up, sir.
No, just again, I think that the ask of our first responders and EMS clinicians is massive. To go out and be in these situations that are incredibly stressful and things like that. It's just so incredibly challenging. I personally feel, in my own experiences, that when I was running 911 calls, and I still run 911 calls, that I find those calls to be especially emotionally challenging, more so than when I have things like a cardiac arrest brought into the hospital. It's just something about showing up on a car wreck, or, going to someone's home where they just just had a cardiac arrest is so much more emotionally charged, at least for me personally, than when somebody comes into the hospital and they're packaged and neat and families actually had a little bit of time to process, like, they driving to the ER, they understand they may be able to get some bad news or that things may not be going well, that their loved one had to come to the emergency department. I just wanted to acknowledge that I think, the potential emotional stakes for our first responders are just so high, and acknowledge that, at least personally as a clinician, I think about you guys a lot and how hard this task is. And I'm just hoping to find ways throughout my career to make, the massive ask we have of our first responders and EMS clinicians a little bit easier and a little bit less daunting.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I want to thank you for placing your course with us. We look forward to growing our relationship, helping you and supporting your research and the research of other first responder clinicians, mental health clinicians that have a behavioral health first responder focus. Reach out to us and see if there's a potential collaboration and a potential fit for what you do and what we're trying to offer to change the paradigm and shift the focus in first responder behavioral health. I want to thank you for watching our episode today with Dr. Zachary Tillett, and check out the rest of our stuff on FRBHI.com. I'm Joseph Brigandi. Take care. I'm Joseph Brigandi. Thank you for joining us for this episode of En Route. En Route is a production of the First Responder Behavioral Health Institute. To learn more about us, head on over to FRBHI.com.